Iban Headhunters. Malayan Emergency, 1948 to 1960. In 1948, the British colony of Malaya was struck by a communist insurgency that aimed to liberate the country from foreign rule and establish a socialist government instead. For the next 12 years, the British fought the insurgents in what they called the Malayan Emergency. Without any foreign support, the communist Malayan National Liberation Army was a much weaker force than the British, who were better equipped, better trained, and had more manpower. However, the Malayan insurgents had the advantage of the jungle, their natural habitat. To fight them, the British had to go deep into the forest, but that was territory that they were unfamiliar with. Therefore, they needed someone to guide them through the dense jungle of Malaya. Their trackers were men brought in from a loyal tribe from the Sarawak province on the island of Borneo, the Iban people. Throughout the war, the Ibans were the eyes and ears of the British forces in the jungle, their tracking skills being invaluable in helping hunt down the insurgents. However, apart from being good trackers, the Ibans were better known for another one of their habits, that of headhunting. The Ibans are just one of the headhunter tribes from the island of Borneo, which the British colonists called Barbaric Borneo. One of the original inhabitants of the island, the Iban are a division of the Dayak people. Being the most invasive tribe on the island, they expanded their territory through conflicts with neighboring tribes. However, their headhunting practice was not the product of their aggressiveness as one might think. The Ibans believed that the soul of the head they cut off would watch over their households. They thought that the power and the energy of the warrior that they had decapitated came directly from his head and was transferred to the man who cut it off. The braver the warrior had been in battle, the more valuable his skull was. Headhunting was not a widespread practice among the Iban people, though. Only warrior families were allowed to collect skulls, and possessing them was considered a great honor as well as a great responsibility. The skulls are displayed on support beams in Iban houses and are honored with food offerings. In 1842, when the British took control of the Sarawak region, Sir James Brooke, the new Raja of Sarawak, pacified the Ibans and put an end to their headhunting practices. For an entire century, the Ibans had their traditions suppressed until the outbreak of World War II. In January 1942, the Japanese invaded and occupied the territory of British Borneo. During more than 3 years of occupation, the Japanese oppressed the local population and exposed them to an aggressive campaign of submission. At the beginning of 1943, the Allies deployed Z Special Units to Borneo and the rest to Southeast Asia to operate behind Japanese lines. These units recruited and trained the local tribes in Borneo to fight against the hated Japanese. The fierce Iban warriors were a great psychological asset to the Allies. Their officers encouraged the Iban's warrior spirit, including their headhunting practice. They caused panic among the Japanese when they used their blowpipes to fire poison darts at them because the weapon was completely silent. The Japanese knew that once they had been hit by a dart and it had broken the skin, they only had about 30 minutes before their body would begin to twitch and convulse, followed by cardiac arrest and then death. To add to all this, they knew that the Iban would decapitate them with their parangs, whether they were already dead or not. When the Iban were issued with rifles, the Japanese became even more paranoid of them. In 1945, the Allied troops liberated Borneo and ended the Japanese occupation on the island. The serving Iban warriors were allowed to stand down and return to their homes. But then, a few years later, the British once again called them back into service. This was because in 1948 an uprising broke out in British Malaya. Communist insurgents started a guerrilla warfare against the British authorities by attacking government infrastructures, communication lines, important installations, tin mines, and rubber plantations. The British, unaccustomed to this kind of warfare, responded with a brutal campaign against the civilian population suspected of helping the insurgents. Troops were deployed to protect important economic targets, but the strategy failed as the insurgents remained safe deep in the jungle, and the population was turning its back on the authorities. In 1950, General Sir Harold Rawdon Briggs was brought to Malaya to become Director of Operations. He devised a plan to cut off the insurgents' supply lines coming from the jungle, villages, and farms, and from Chinese squatter communities on the jungle's edge. Briggs knew he had to move deep into the jungle to achieve his goals. Small units of soldiers were ordered to patrol in the jungle, lay ambushes, and carry out attacks on enemy camps. They had to hunt down the insurgents and needed someone who knew their way around the jungle. The Ibans were the perfect choice, having been living their entire lives in a similar environment to that in the Malayan mainland. The Iban trackers began arriving in Malaya during the first days of the emergency in 1948. Initially, they came in small numbers to serve a 3-month term only. However, when the Briggs Plan began to be implemented, the need for Iban trackers increased, and in late 1952, there were 301 of them attached to the British troops in Malaya. They were trained by the men of the 22nd Special Air Service Regiment in the use of modern weapons. Back in their own units, they passed their tracking skills on to the other soldiers, and especially to the Gurkhas. Even though they only served as civilians in the British Army, the Ibans fought alongside the troops, and they fought bravely. One of the trackers, Awang Anak Rawing of Skarang, was even awarded a civilian George Cross Award for bravery shown in combat. Eventually, the British acknowledged their service, and in 1953 granted them full military status as a regimental formation, and they became the Sarawak Rangers. These Rangers wore the same uniforms as the regular British troops, the 1950 pattern jungle green shirts and trousers or shorts. Traditionally, the Ibans often only wore trousers, with their upper body naked. Most of them had long hair tied in a loose bun. They were distinctive with their stretched and pierced earlobes and bodies covered in tattoos. Especially significant were the lines tattooed on the backs of their hands. Only warriors who had taken human heads had them, one line for each head cut off. Another headhunting trophy was a lock of human hair that they attached to the hilt of a parang knife, the Iban's traditional weapon. Without a doubt, during the Malayan emergency, the Ibans continued with their traditional headhunting activities. They had a centuries-old dislike for the mainland Malays and didn't restrain from showing it. The British military initially denied any knowledge of the Ibans practicing headhunting. However, on April 28 of 1952, the British newspaper The Daily Worker published a photo of a Royal Marine in the company of Iban trackers exhibiting the heads of 2 insurgents. The photo incited moral outrage in the United Kingdom, and the government was forced to investigate the matter. On May 7, 1952, the government acknowledged the photo's authenticity, but claimed the incident to be an isolated one. They said the head of the insurgent was brought to the military base by an Iban tracker for identification purposes, and British soldiers had nothing to do with it. However, Colonial Secretary Oliver Littleton later confirmed to Parliament that the Ibans had been allowed to practice headhunting. Despite the bad reputation gained, the Iban trackers continued to serve the British until the end of the Malayan emergency. Just before the end of the war on April 1, 1960, they were reformed into the Sarawak Rangers, Far East Land Forces, and became part of the British Army. Being a regular force now, they were forbidden to headhunt anymore. In 1963, when an independent Malaya united with the Crown colonies of North Borneo and Sarawak, the Sarawak Rangers became the 1st Battalion, Royal Ranger Regiment of the Malaysian Army. It is still possible to find older Iban men with lines tattooed on the backs of their hands. These elders are the last of the once fierce warriors, the notorious Iban headhunters.